Welcome back, everyone, to A Vacuous Vocation. Today we have Professor Thaddeus Russell.
No.
No.
No, you're already screwing up, Matt.
Okay.
I am no longer
Just that.
professor, and I'm very proud that I'm no longer professor. To me, that's an epithet. That's like calling me the N-word. Don't call me professor.
Okay. So we have Thaddeus Russell. Well, I do want to say that this is an honor for me because you're one of my top 5 modern political dissident thinkers. And the reason why I didn't invite you...
but like seriously, like just like with like, but like exactly where do I rank? Like 1 to 5.
Okay, I'll keep Darren Jordan.
You're trying to tell me? Don't tell me there's 4 people smarter than me.
I'll tell you exactly who they are, who I think.
Oh,
no, not smarter than you, but just...
This is going to make me... No, don't. No, it's going to make me upset. Don't. I don't want to know whose company I'm in. I'm going to be upset, Matt. This is a bad way to start the show.
No,
don't piss off your guest. You're going to compare me to these jackasses, and I know they're inferior to me, so don't do it.
This is... Okay, not in order. Darren Jordan, Curtis Yarvin, Michael Malice, Dave Smith, Thaddeus Russell.
Okay. I will say that was better than I thought, and... 3 of the 4 I agree with. I'm not gonna name the 4th, but yeah. Or I'm not offended by being in their company at all. Like that's great. I'm not gonna say who the 4th is, but anyway, yeah. So okay.
So also
thank you.
Yeah.
You really scared me though, because sometimes you hear like I've heard this so many times, like
right. Yeah.
Oh Thaddeus Russell, yes. You said that one thing about COVID in 2020, and that's why you're one of my all-time favorite intellectuals. You and Alex Jones and Peter, Peter McCullough, and like I'm trying to think of like more discredited people. Matt's camera he's working on it.
I'm back.
Don't worry. Back. He warned me before, so
here. Okay. We gotta switch cameras already.
All right.
Right on the intro.
So don't you want to like say why I'm here and like how this happened?
Yeah. So I had
tell the story. Wait, no. Tell like the proximate reason first. I mean, like why am I on this show? Why am I?
You're on this show
because
you asked.
There it is. Because I asked to be on it. Thank you. Okay, that's the proximate cause of my appearance on this show, right?
Yes.
Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah.
What happened, Matt?
I'll tell you what happened.
Shout out my window at you? How did I ask?
You emailed me, Matt.
Email.
Can I come on the show too?
Had we had a conversation recently, or was this like we had talked? And you can get to this in a minute. Like many years ago for a second on email, but we hadn't spoken at all since then. So this was out of the blue, right, Matt?
Let me explain myself. Okay. 2 major reasons why I didn't invite you before I invited Michael. First off, because
Michael Weimer.
Michael Weimer, your producer and co-host of Unreported.
The star, otherwise known as the star of Unreported. Yep. Mm-hmm.
This is why that, because I saw you going on Joe Rogan, and I was like, and then I'm looking at, I'm merging the reasons. One is my podcast. This isn't my 3rd interview. This is like my 2nd season. I've rebranded. I've only done like 10 interviews.
Oh,
yeah,
I know that.
But like I've taken time off, and I came back, and I'm like, this just looks unprofessional. So like, there was just some insecurity, or I'm like, why would Thad want to like get on this? I don't have thousands of followers.
You're not explaining the story at all.
My point.
So you want me to tell the story?
No. Wait, hold on. And then also my professor, Darren Jordan, who is a renegade professor in his own right of economics at Occidental. I think that, so I've heard Joe Rogan be like, if you really want to not get someone on my podcast, ask them to be on my podcast. So I'm like, part of the way I was like trying to, I guess, see if I could help my professor was like, I don't know, if I could like make a connection with Michael. And then I was trying to ask Michael too, and Michael was in on being like, yeah, like let me get Darren's email, let me recommended to Thad. And so it's like we weren't trying to like be secretive or anything like that. It just happened to unfold this way. And
I know. Sorry, Darren, shut the fuck up. Okay, let me take over here. Okay. So the broader reason that I'm on this show is that we have another connection, which is that you began studying as a student at Occidental College, I think the year after I left my teaching position at Occidental College, which was like when, 2015 for you? Or
I started 2016.
So I left in 2015. That's right. And you, when you got there, you had seen me on the Rogan show, right? Mm-hmm. And you wanted to hang out with me. You wanted to talk to me.
Yeah.
And so you emailed me to say that. And I said, hey, Matt, sorry, but I'm no longer there. But you should take my online courses instead. It's the only place to find me at that point. So, yeah. So then, now take the story up from there. Now people are properly grounded.
Yeah.
Now they know what's going on. They know what's going on. Okay.
So, well, then you left, I guess, and then I was there, but luckily I met a professor, Darren Jurgen, who taught economics, and he was recommended by like guys on the baseball team, like, oh, you should meet this libertarian professor, because they knew.
Oh, sorry, you were on the baseball team, by the way.
I played baseball. Yeah.
That's right. They were badass when I was there.
Yeah.
They were an awesome team when I was there. I watched them practice a couple times. I was like, damn, this looks like a AAA team.
Yeah.
They were great. And they were champions in their league. And you must be a badass baseball player.
Yeah, I actually ended up quitting after my junior year. I lost the love for it. Yeah. I got into jiu-jitsu. And I know you practiced Muay Thai. Yeah, I've been doing jiu-jitsu for like 5 years now.
I've rolled a bit too. Yep.
Yeah. With the 10th Planet. So like
nice.
Yeah.
In Phoenix now? Or?
No, I started at 10th Planet Pasadena and then going to HQ in LA, saying what's up to Eddie.
You didn't go to Eddie Bravo's?
A few times,
Eddie Bravo's? Oh, you did? Cool, yeah.
Yeah, Eddie's
nice.
Awesome. And now I'm training at 10th Planet Scottsdale.
Fantastic. That's awesome, yeah. I want to go to 10th Planet. Anyway, all right. Excellent. Okay. So yeah, and then you sort of followed me over the years, right?
Yeah, so my older brother actually introduced me to much of your work, and he was a student at Willamette for a year, which...
Oh.
Yeah.
Who's your older brother?
His name's Andrew Geiger, but he kind of dropped out of there, so he...
He was in my class?
No, I think just after you.
Oh, you guys.
Yeah.
You guys are hilarious. Yeah. I gotta say, the Geiger boys. Okay,
you know what?
You gotta work on your timing.
You know what's funny?
Say that.
My dad.
It's a family problem apparently.
Oh,
does your dad miss people by a year? Also,
you know what's funny? My dad and my uncle, his older brother, also went to Occidental, also studied economics. My uncle was top of his class there. My dad, when I mentioned like, oh, I'm talking to you, he's like, oh, was he there when I was there? I was like, no, Dad, he's like younger than you.
Not much. Maybe not actually. Much. Wait, I'm your dad's age.
He graduated in 85.
I could be older than your dad.
No, but my dad's
I'm 58.
Yeah, my dad's like early 60s.
Oh, okay. We're close.
Yeah, you're close. Okay, we were talking about before the show a little bit about American history, and this is a fun fact. I'm also related to Jefferson Davis. He's my great-great-great-grandmother's cousin.
Fascinating guy, that Jeff Davis. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, don't say that. I mean, you're saying it publicly, but okay.
I mean, yeah, I've heard people who've been like, you should be proud of that.
Man, do you know Brian McClanahan?
I've heard the name.
The historian. He's like a paleo, I guess, conservative historian.
Okay.
He's been on my show a couple years ago, I think. He's tremendous, and he's been on Tom Woods. He does Tom Woods stuff a lot. And I mean, one of his really baseline arguments is that the culture of the Old South, the intellectual culture of the Old South, the aesthetic culture of the Old South, the minds of the great Confederates, and the great pro-slavery ideologues, the Calhouns and the Fitzhughs and the Jefferson Davises, and there's so many more. I mean, it's a lost kingdom of immense riches of all kinds. And that's why, like, Gone with the Wind had so much power and resonance, and I think it's kind of a reason why it's been banned, essentially, culturally, is that it shows that. It's the last sort of image we have of that. Now, of course, it's all glamorized and sentimentalized, Gone with the Wind, but no, a lot of that's true, though. I mean, it was a true aristocracy. Now, the thing is, aristocracies have produced, yes, inequality and hierarchy and domination and, some particular forms of oppression, sure, slavery. But they've also indisputably produced what most people consider to be many or most of the world's great works of art and works of literature and works of philosophy, going all the way back. I mean, take away the Medicis and who do you have, in Italy, right? Who do you have in the modern era now? And that's just them. I mean, there's so many others. So anyway, the Old South has, we're not allowed to read Jefferson Davis seriously. What did the dude say? What was the argument for slavery? Turns out, like, and this is what Brian McClanahan says also often, which is also very true, like, intellectually, the defenses of slavery they made were just very narrow parts of their broader worldview. And the broader worldview has actually a lot of appeal to people today in the United States, much of it being decentralist, anti-federalist, anti-government, anti-Washington, D.C., sort of anti-imperialist, very much anti-imperialist. I mean, there is a little bit of a debate about that among slaveholders, whether they were imperialist or not because of the westward expansion. That was economic entirely. They didn't do it for ideological reasons. But anyway, there was none of this ideological imperialism that you had in the North that ended up winning. So anyway, congratulations on being, just because the other thing to say is that most Americans believed in slavery until 1865. Even most Americans in the North were pro-slavery until the war actually happened. That accounts for the draft riots in New York City in 1863, which was a revolt against the entire war, in which half of it was lynching blacks because they were saying, "I'm not going to die for you." So it's kind of like, and by the way, that's another way in which racism and anti-imperialism have often been intertwined, which is very tough for us anti-imperialists, but it's just true. Racists have been useful at times in being anti-imperialists. So the big anti-imperialist league, which was co-founded by Mark Twain in the late 19th century, you know about this history? Half of it was segregationists, was Southern politicians, straight up racist, like scientific racist segregationists. Their argument was against empire was, you want to go to the Philippines? It was around that time, Spanish-American War, right? You want to go to the Philippines? Send our boys halfway across the world to go to the Philippines and stay there? They're a bunch of brown savages. No, stay away from those people. Don't try to uplift them. Also, they're hopeless. You can't uplift them. They'll never be like us. But the liberal progressive vision was imperialist. It said, oh, no, they can be just like us. We just have to train them. Once we teach them to be like us, they'll be, which is, the soul of imperialist thinking was progressivism. But at the time, not all, but many, maybe most of the anti-imperialists were straight up racist. I mean, no bones about it. Right? And that was their argument. In fact, the argument was that's a form of race mixing, they said. And what we will do is we'll establish, once we have a colony somewhere, what happens next is basically there's like a bridge from the colony back to the homeland, and the goddamn brown savages will walk across it, and because they said, look at other colonies. You see remigration of the colonized, and look at Europe now. You look, it's true. Like, yes, I mean, Europe now is very, very brown. Colonial subjects came back to roost, as it were. And so now does that mean that anti-imperialism is wrong? No. But anyway, thank you. I mean, the Jefferson Davis thing, your heritage, your proud heritage, just, hold up a fist. That's all. You'll be fine. People will love that. Just be proud of who you are, your heritage, Matt, just The roots, yeah, be proud, put up a fist. Have a nation too. Maybe you should have a nation. Just don't use a color name. Just you're gonna have a nation. The Jefferson Davis Nation. No, but it just reminded me of all that. That it's not that you're probably well, it is like dangerous to say. I'm sort of half kidding here. Like it is sort of dangerous to say that, or certainly not a badge of honor, right? It's a badge of shame to say you're descended from Jefferson Davis. I mean, I think it should be neither. But what it is to me is like an invitation to talk about a very interesting part of an important part of American history that gets completely squashed. We're just not allowed to even think about them in any serious way. Like, it's a terrible tragedy.
Yeah.
Culturally.
I remember, I don't know. I guess it's debatable amongst historians, but when I was in DC last month, we had a few like seminars from historians. One was at the Cato Institute, and they were talking about World War II. We actually took a field trip to the Battle of it's blanking right now. But the
which war?
It was the big one of the Civil War.
Oh, Bull Run near DC.
Not Bull Run.
Okay.
The town.
There's a few near DC.
Yeah, about 30 minutes north.
Not Harper's Ferry.
No.
Okay.
The biggest, bloodiest.
I mean, there's many in Virginia, yeah, and Maryland. I don't know.
Yeah, it will come back to me. I don't know why I forget that one. But like historians will debate, was it a war of secession, or was it a war to keep slaves? And I don't know. I mean, like, because I've heard from, libertarians say it was a war of secession. And then I have these historians who are saying, like, no, actually, like, if you look at what a lot of, like, the Southerners and the Confederates said, they wanted to, like, keep slavery. And then, like, slavery was inefficient. And so then the cotton gin and, like, we can...
Yeah. I'm going to say something. So you and I, before we started recording... I was trashing libertarians upside and down. But I'm going to say something that I firmly believe, and I think, and I've never said this publicly, but libertarians in general and libertarian historians in particular will appreciate this. So I'm sure know, like, I received a PhD in American history, U.S. history from Columbia University.
I didn't even get to introduce you and mention that.
It's okay. It's all right. I'm saying this for a very particular point. I then was a professor of U.S. history at Columbia Barnard College for many years, and then at multiple other universities over the subsequent decade. I have published 2 books in U.S. history and written multiple articles, including academic journal articles, and at Columbia, one of my advisors was Eric Foner, who is universally considered to be the leading historian of the Civil War, generally speaking. I mean, I should say the politics of the Civil War, right? And Reconstruction. Eric Foner is the man. He is the historian laureate of the United States of America. I was his teaching assistant for multiple courses. So I taught the Civil War and Reconstruction and slavery under Eric Foner. Libertarian historians are 100% correct about the Civil War, about slavery, about Reconstruction when they talk about it. Yes, it was a war. This is obvious, actually, to me, but it's been larded on with all the civil rights thinking since the 1960s. Like, historians have looked at it and been, no, it has to be about racial justice. It has to be about racial justice. It has to be a good thing, and the only way to make it a good thing is to make the Civil War about racial justice, because 600,000 bodies were lying on fields. So we've got to make this into a good thing, and that's a tough one. And the only way that'll convince Americans after a world war against Nazism is to say to them, oh, that other war was also about racial justice. This is a post-World War II story. The story of the Civil War is actually a story about what happened after World War II, which was the advent of racial liberalism, when it became absolutely required to find virtue only or mostly or primarily in racial equality. So the war that happened between 1861 and 1865 would be considered by the left wing today, Matt Geiger, a complete tragedy and abomination if they haven't been taught over the last 60 years that it was actually a war for racial egalitarianism. And so we had all the evidence, of course, about the Civil War. I mean, there's not much that has been discovered in the last 50 years, really. I mean, not a whole lot. Not about those questions anyway. About what the politicians were thinking. We've known what the politicians were thinking, what they said, why they were going to war. All of them we've known since 1861. It's in the public record. So we know Lincoln said it, all the Sumner said it, all the Confederates said it. They all said over and over, and they were very loquacious men too. There's no short. I don't even know where the idea that it was for the slaves comes from, because even the left wing has said the far left wing has said for decades, since I was in high school. I remember my history teacher at Berkeley High School saying that Lincoln was a racist. And I was like, what? And it turns out he sure was. But not just a racist. That's not the point. The point is that he said this is a war for the Union. Over and over in multiple ways, they all did. This is a war for the Union. Now, there were radical Republicans on the fringes of his party. Thaddeus Stevens, not my namesake, but he was kind of the left wing of the so he was the most fervent pro-war politician in Congress. And he I think he married a black woman, and he's buried in a black cemetery, and boy, did he hate slavery, but for a lot of the wrong reasons, which is another story. But I think even he was one of the very few Republicans who was anything like that, an actual anti-racist, and he really was. Even he was, I think, primarily concerned, because he was from the North, that his country was being broken apart. But I know that Lincoln and the leaders of the Republican Party, who seized control of the federal government, and counterattacked the South, or attacked the South, and I will accept either. I don't care. No, the South wanted out, and they were being encroached upon. And there's a longer story too, and some of that Eric Foner's right about. But that actually sort of proves the point. His original dissertation, his first book, is his only good book, published in 1969, in which he argues very persuasively to this day that the popularity of the war in the North, which is hard to explain, right? On the surface, why did people in New York City take guns down to Georgia and die to what? And he shows that it was not abolitionism. It was not an anti-racist, anti-slavery thing. It was what he calls it was called itself the Free Soil Movement, which was a fear that the plantation owners would move up north and take control and then kick out all the yeoman farmers, all the white farmers. And which was most of the population of the country. The overwhelming majority of Americans in 1860 were farmers, lived on farms. And so that's an obvious appeal. That can scare the shit out of people. And the plantation owners, and there was some reason to think that might happen too. It wasn't completely insane. But that's why they went to war. That's why they were willing to send their boys off to war down south to fight for because they thought they called it the slave power. They didn't care about slavery. They cared about the power of the slave owners. They called it the slave power is coming to get us too. And also it was racist because a lot of it was they're bringing the Negroes with them. And now we're going to have to be living with Negroes here in Kansas. So, yeah, it was not ever about slavery. And again, even left-wing historians have said this for forever, really. But nonetheless, though, when left-wing historians and everybody on the left wing does a shorthand version of the Civil War, like if they just make a quick reference to it, it's always a virtuous thing. It's always a virtuous thing to them, right? It's the one thing that America did right. That and World War II, they're wrong about both counts. But with the Civil War, right? That's the one. That was the redemption of our original sin. That's how people think of it today, including on the left. I mean, the left thinks of the Civil War as a great, heroic achievement that everyone should be proud of as Americans, you know. And I mean, just 600,000 dead bodies.
Well, they
alone should make you just like, but it's incredible. They don't even pause on that.
Yeah. Well, it ended racism. Yeah. Or it ended slavery. Excuse me. The Civil War ended slavery. Right.
Now, the other thing that libertarian historians are right about is, I'm blanking on his name though. What's the great libertarian historian who's done this history?
Tom
made the argument. Yes, DiLorenzo. No, there's a better. Well, he has two, but there's another one who's even better. Who's at San Jose State?
Hummel? No.
Yes, Jeffrey Hummel. Yes, Jeffrey Hummel. Yeah, DiLorenzo-ish. Jeffrey Hummel is a true academic scholar who's done the best work on this. No, I mean, he can't prove it, but he makes a very, very compelling case. And I sort of saw, and we kind of, even at Columbia, we sort of said this among ourselves in some ways, that slavery in this country was on its way out, that its internal combustion machine was bound to fail, that enslaved labor, it turns out, is super unproductive and inefficient, you know, which of course I've written about extensively in Renegade History as being like one of the virtues of the slaves was that they refused to work well as slaves. And then of course we're tarred as being lazy, you know, from racists. It's like, no, excuse me, guys. No, that whole thing started when they were forced to work for nothing and they refused to work well. And there's lots of evidence of that. And we just know that. I mean, the productivity, the left is trying to change that now. I don't know if you know this, but the whole historiography of slavery now is that it was super productive, super capitalistic, don't you know, Matt? And that it was thriving, it was moving westward, there were more slaves than ever, producing more cotton, yada, yada, yada. I mean, it's just, okay, well, if you want to completely redefine capitalism, fine, and take like the wage labor part out of it, which is pretty crucial. It's just nuts. But no, it was falling apart and was doomed to fail, certainly in competition with the capitalist North, which was producing railroads. And by 1869 had a coast-to-coast railroad immediately. The South had to, the North is the ones who built the railroads in the South. They were quite backwards in large part because their workforce was mostly, not entirely, but mostly slave labor who didn't want to work well or efficiently. Duh. And that was one of the major arguments of the abolitionists, in fact, was that slavery makes the slaves lazy and unproductive. And this is why we need to overthrow it.
Well, I mean, I guess it's very useful. It's a very useful argument if you're anti-capitalistic to rewrite it that way as like,
well, yeah, the bad guys, you know, and of course, capitalism has also been compared to fascism by the left often, very often. They see it, you know, yeah. If you're bad, and then racism is all, you know, on the far left, you'll see this all the time, that racism is capitalism and vice versa. It's all the same. I mean, that's sort of dumb stuff. But, you know, I mean, again, like the serious Marxists don't do that. But the kind of lazy lefties, which is most of them, that's their formulations. Yeah.
I guess in their arc of history, it's like the Civil War was fought to end slavery, but now we have to deal with racism, and our modern day battle is against racism. And
yeah, and so here's where the left comes down also, and this is everybody on the left, the entire liberal left spectrum from Marxist all the way down to Democrat, to Joe Biden, is that Reconstruction was awesome. Like, that's their favorite thing in American history is Reconstruction. That was the coolest thing. That was some of them will say it's the only good thing the U.S. ever did. Even more than the New Deal. The New Deal is a little bit controversial slightly on the left. Not Reconstruction. Oh, they love them some Reconstruction. They can't get enough of the U.S. Army invading and occupying a foreign territory and then implanting thousands of schools and teachers to teach the children of the newly colonized, which is Reconstruction. I mean, what? Like, it was the first colony of the U.S. Of course it was. It was the first Afghanistan, I have said. They literally taught the children in the South how to think for generations, forced them to. They killed the entire literally killed the entire political leadership, or put them in prison, or disenfranchised them, or all three. Confederates were disenfranchised after the war. You couldn't vote. White men, I think in some states, just white men were disenfranchised after the war to keep them out of power permanently, which they were for 12 years. So this was so they're colonialists too, the left. And I have almost never heard anybody on the left ever be confronted with their feelings about Reconstruction, which it always is. It's always just feelings, But like, wait a second. What was it now? What was the Army there for? And by the way, virtually the entire U.S. Army was in the South. I mean, this was a massive military occupation because it's a huge territory to conquer and control. And then you had ex-Confederates and sort of various clan organizations who were not just racist, that was part of it, but very much anti-union and anti-Reconstruction occupation. And like Hamas has some definite racists in it, and I'm completely anti-Zionist, don't get me wrong, but like clearly there's some racists on both sides. But like people on the left don't ever say that. Like, but there's very much racist down there in the South. But they have a broader cause, like you might say Hamas, if you're on the left, that you could side with the broader cause of eliminating a Jewish ethno-state, which great, I get that. Yeah, but Hamas, that's their broader cause. It's not to kill Jews, but they also have a bunch of people who really think Jews are a separate and bad race. Now, the Hamas has changed its charter and they're not officially anti-Semitic anymore. They're really anti-Zionist, but whatever. I'm sure that there's a lot of anti-Semites in Gaza for understandable reasons, but whatever. So the Klan was racist as fuck, of course. And one of their primary objectives was to disarm the ex-slaves. By the way, they were the first gun control organization in the country, was the Ku Klux Klan. But their bigger objective was to kick the Union occupiers out of their land. They were anti-colonialists, guys. I thought we liked that. I thought we liked anti-colonialists, especially violent ones. We love the violent anti-colonialists the most. Why don't we dig the Klan? Hamas has racists in it. You think the anti-colonialist movements in Africa didn't have some anti-white racists in it? Hell yeah, they did. Of course. Now, I understand it. I don't blame them. And that's kind of one of the reasons I was on their side. Even though they were anti-racist against me often. I still wanted them to have their independence, and I wanted no longer my country or my ancestors' countries to control them. Matt Geiger, do something about this.
Well, we could touch on foreign policy in Israel and Palestine, because I do want to ask you about that. Well, maybe I'll just ask you now. The Christian conservative support for Israel in this country, does it? I feel like it might come from the prophecy that this is the Holy Land, and like it's. I don't know, like, I don't even understand the argument, but do you know what I'm referring to? Because I know that like, well, yeah. We gotta kill the Palestinians because, of course, Israel needs this land. Yeah,
so I know absolutely the whole political history of the Christian evangelicals. What I don't know is what we call the social history of it. So I don't know, I can't give you an intelligent reading of the motives here, which I agree is odd. Now, what we could do, though, is possibly surmise some motives by looking at the political history and then maybe figuring out now I'm sort of thinking aloud here. Okay, so Christian evangelical movement for Israel begins in earnest in the 80s. I'm sure it had antecedents, but in earnest under Reagan. It was kind of a Reagan era thing. This is when AIPAC is ramping up and becoming a real force in American politics and starting to spend a lot of money. 87 is the first intifada. Well, you have the Lebanon War, early 80s. The Marines get blown up in 1983 in Lebanon, right? Reagan pulls out the Marines, 200-something Marines, or 240 get killed, and he pulls out the rest, I think, which was one of the few moves by a president in that way, to like preemptively withdraw. And then the first intifada begins in 87. So this is a time when Israel's in real crisis, wall to wall. After the 67 and 73 wars, all the way through the 70s, Israel was like considered almost universally, even by lefties in this country, almost universally as a really cool country of Holocaust survivors. And aren't they awesome? And they're democratic, and they're all Holocaust survivors, and fuck, that's awesome. And they built their own country. Everybody was into them. With Lebanon and their invasions into Lebanon, and that's when they started doing mass killings of civilians and made Beirut into the synonym for war-torn city, right? Beirut became the thing you would say, like, oh, this place, downtown Detroit, it looks like Beirut. I mean, that's what Israel did. People forget that. It's like the whole Beirut slogan. That's what Israel did to a city. That's why we use that term to describe a bombed-out looking city. And we know subsequently that it's called the Dahiya doctrine. That internally, the IDF has a doctrine called the Dahiya doctrine, named after the main neighborhood in Beirut that they bombed in the Lebanon War. That they will allow themselves to bomb indiscriminately civilian neighborhoods if they suspect that Hezbollah or Hamas might use them. And that's documented, the Dahiya doctrine. People can look it up. I think it's even on Wikipedia. And so during that time, Israel's they're in massive crisis. They're now bombing neighborhoods. That's how in crisis. They're not. I'm an anti-Zionist, but I don't think that Israelis are evil. I don't think they do this because they're racist. I think they feel truly threatened, and you can sort of understand why. And we haven't talked about the second intifada, which was truly horrific, and most of it was utterly indefensible, like just killing random civilians in the middle of Tel Aviv. But the first intifada was not anyway. But the point is that they were in crisis, and it really looked, for the first time since the 73 war, that Israel might not make it. And so that's when AIPAC gears up. That's when Reagan also gears up his support for Israel. Even though he pulls out the Marines, he still was a staunch Israel supporter all the way through. And then the other thing that's happening in the 80s in a even bigger way is the rise of the Christian evangelical movement in the United States. Now, I don't know the exact history of this, but I'm assuming that AIPAC noticed this and then came up, I'm betting, I don't know, but I'm betting, came up with some theological argument for why Christian evangelicals in Alabama should support the state of Israel. And then started going, and because this is how the way AIPAC and the Israel lobby generally operates. They then just literally go door to door, offering money or something, or just being persistent. And they managed to convince a generation or two of Christian pastors, mostly in the South and the Midwest, that Israel's destiny is your destiny. And the theological argument that I've heard that they've made is that, and I don't know if this is totally true, but that I've heard that they make is that the second coming of Jesus Christ requires the return of the Jews to the Holy Land. Yeah. So that's why they want to do this. Now, that's a very cynical reading. And it may be, I don't know. I haven't heard, these evangelical preachers talk about Israel much. I haven't paid attention to that really. It could be the argument. I haven't actually seen that, so I don't know. I I don't think it's at this point just cynical in that way. I can't believe that they're this committed to such a basically an abstract concept, right? If you're a Christian in Alabama, it's an abstract cause, Israel. You only see about it like on your TV screens or your computer screens. I mean, it's not part of your lived experience. It's not anything you can touch or feel, or, it's amazing that they've sustained this level of passion. It's a purely ideological cause, is my point. The way that like people in Berkeley, California are passionate about the Palestinian cause. Like some Jewish guy in Berkeley is passionate about the Palestinian cause, and there's a lot of those people who've never been to the Middle East, right? So I do think at this point, I don't want to say that it's cynical in that way. I do think that, okay, another way to explain this is that what happens after the 80s, right? Then the 90s, Oslo fails, and then the second Intifada happens beginning in 2000. Hamas is blowing up people, suicide vests, on buses in Tel Aviv, in restaurants, in pizza parlors, in cafes, in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, on the street in Jerusalem. I mean, the number one Jewish Israeli anti-Zionist is Miko Peled. And he's devoted his entire, he's an anti-Zionist too. He wears a Palestine flag on his lapel. He's the son of a major IDF general. And Miko's sister is like one of the other major anti-Zionist Jews in Israeli. Her daughter was blown up in Jerusalem, but Miko's niece was blown up in Jerusalem by a suicide bomber in the Second Intifada. They're still anti-Zionists, and they haven't changed their politics one bit. Speaks to their commitment, but also it speaks to how ridiculous and this is also, for the first time, I'm like talking about Israeli society's response to October 7th. Like, I can understand it, because it is a small country, and people sort of do know everyone else, seems like, or there's 7 million, and among the Jews especially, I think there's a lot of that cross-socialization. People know each other. Yeah, traumatic and terrifying. And so that's the Intifada beginning in 2000. And then what do we have in 2001? They blow up the goddamn World Trade Center and kill 3,000 Americans, these fucking Muslims, right? People forget that the suicide vest thing that Sam Harris talks about all the time, suicide bomber thing, that was the Second Intifada invention. That's when they started doing that. And then you've got 9/11. Boom, boom. Within a 2-year period, you got both children in suicide vest bombs, bomb vests, blowing themselves up in public places in Israel. And then you've got them throwing airplanes into buildings and killing. Right? So the level of freak out, and then you've got the neocons immediately after that pushing everyone to look at Iraq and Saddam, and oh my God, there's more crazy Arabs over here too. And they're the ones who are really going to kill us all. And so the anti-Arab, anti-Muslim hysteria between 2000 and 2003-4 is just off the charts. And if anybody listening who had lived through that time as an adult knows exactly what I'm talking about. You had Arabs and Muslims and even Sikhs, because dumbass Americans don't know that Sikhs aren't Muslims, getting killed. Multiple Sikhs got killed because they wore a turban and people thought they were Arabs. And multiple Arabs were killed, and Muslims too, during that period in the United States. There were basically lynchings. And the FBI was all over them and infiltrating all their organizations and rounding them up and putting them in prison. And most of those, and then a lot of those guys ended up in Guantanamo and on no charges. And it was, yeah. So there you got the Christian evangelical movement. It emerges in the 1980s under Reagan. It remains very, very powerful in the 90s. By the 2000s, though, we knew that church attendance was falling across the U.S. Yeah, you had the mega churches. Again, that's the Christian evangelical effervescence, still continuing as a movement. But there was a sort of a crisis in the church too around this. And this general secularization of American society continued with the rise of the internet. The internet has been real bad in some, it's been good in some corners for Christianity, for evangelicals, but generally speaking, what's the internet used for? Porn. It's not a good time for Christians of that variety. And so I wonder if that's part of it. There was a new cause, but it was also a great time to be an anti-Muslim. Tremendous time to be an anti-Muslim, because we also know them as Muslims as anti-Christians. They're not just anti-Jewish, they're also anti-Christians, aren't they? Yeah. They want to kill everybody, and most importantly, they want to replace Judeo-Christian law. That's when the right wing started talking about Judeo-Christian law to differentiate from Islam. They want to replace it with Islam, Sharia. Oh my God. And to this day, there's still nutbags on the right who talk about the danger of Sharia law getting introduced in the United States. They were saying this about all the cities in Europe 10, 20 years ago with a little bit more justification, because you do have large Muslim immigrant populations in Europe. But I'm still waiting for that. Where's the Sharia law in any European city or town? Any of them. Name one. Show me one piece of hysteria. That was 20 years ago. They were talking about that. Douglas Murray's whole career is built on that. Sam Harris built his career on that. Fear of the Muslim and their takeover. So anyway, I think that's when the evangelicals started ramping up their Zionist shit, because they wanted to kill some Muslims, honest to God. And I really mean that. They loved the Iraq War. They were all in on the Iraq War. They wanted to go harder on Iraq and Afghanistan, meaning the Christian evangelical right wing, who were also Zionists, because they were following Netanyahu's lead at that point. And Netanyahu was the number one cheerleader for the Iraq War. Number one, more than any American. He was he appeared before Congress to testify about Saddam being a threat with weapons of mass destruction. And half of Congress, or 2/3 of Congress, is in the pockets of AIPAC. So they listen to whatever Bibi says. It's a wild thing, and it's sort of funny. Like the Christian support for Israel, it feels, I know the numbers don't show this, but I think the numbers are really fallacious. Growing up I'm quarter Jewish, my mother's Jewish, my son is Jewish, my ex-wife is Jewish, my first long-term girlfriend was Jewish. I've been an in-law in 2 huge, prominent Jewish families. I grew up in Berkeley, and then I lived in New York for 17 years, and then LA for 8 years. Like I went to Columbia University. I've been around some Jews. Like, it's just, I lived in Jewish neighborhoods in Brooklyn. Jews have been my life. I can think of the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Jews I've known, I can think of 5, maybe 6, who have been to Israel. And even those people never fucking talked about Israel. No one cares about Israel. Even when Palestinians would blow up shit, none of my Jewish friends talked about it. No one ever talked about Israel. My best friends in New York, I had multiple Jewish friends, my best friends in New York City for years and years. I don't remember ever, except for one who was an anti-Zionist. In recent years, especially in the last 7 months, I have known about and become friends with and had on my show dozens and dozens of Jewish anti-Zionists. And so my experience with Jews on the question of Israel is 95% total indifference and 5% anti-Zionism. I mean, it's a fraud. Now, that American Jews are all united behind Israel and all Zionists, when you ask them, some poll taker comes up to them and says, are you in favor of the right of Israel to, they'll say yes, of course. But first of all, that's not going to be the case anymore, but that's all they'll ever do. They don't give a shit about Israel. Trust me. Now, there is a significant portion of American Jews. Here's how they get them. There's a great movie out now called Israel. What's it called? About this. It's about the inculcation of Zionist ideals in American Jews. It's called Israel something. Just came out. Highly recommend it. But summer camps. So there's Zionist summer camps all over America. And there is that is kind of like a little wedge of American Jewish culture. I have had many friends, still a minority, but many friends who've gone to Zionist summer camps when they were kids, and those kids end up being like, they visit Israel because they take the birthright trip where you get to have sex with IDF soldiers,
Okay.
but which Max Blumenthal talks about this. He did it. And I had my friends who did take the trips to Israel. The only story they would tell me about it was fucking an IDF soldier.
Like both?
It turns
Like
out,
girls and guys?
yep.
Whoa.
Yes. So it turns out that there's some that's what it's about. That they sort of set up they have these parties and big events. They don't like force anybody to have sex, but they just, you bring in like a bunch of young IDF soldiers and a bunch of college student Jews from America, put them in a room, have some dancing and music and some alcohol. And what do you think's going to happen? And then they're very committed to this state of Israel. Then it's like they have a real like, and a lot of like boyfriend and girlfriend things come out of that too. But yeah, people come do their birthright trips, and unless you're Max Blumenthal, you come out of there thinking, God, this is my country, and you have all sorts of real feelings for it. And it's where everyone's Jewish. Oh my God, I'm Jewish. Oh my God, they celebrate Judaism everywhere, and I'm not weird anymore. I get it. And it's cool. Tel Aviv is an awesome place to hang out. I get it. Jerusalem's gorgeous. I get it. But so yeah, what I was going to say, my punchline here, is that given all that data I just presented about Christians supporting Israel and Jews being indifferent for the most part, unless they went to a Jewish Zionist summer camp, it seems to me that hardcore support for Israel now is larger among Christians than among Jews.
Yeah. So you got me thinking that this evangelical support for Israel is influenced by the idea that, well, in order to get the rapture to come back, we need Israel to, have control of the Holy Land. And so I think that the evangelical or the whole like Christian conception of heaven and hell is like kind of out of the fear of death in a way, and not like I mean, I guess it's their understanding of life and death and their fear of it that then like ultimately, if I get raptured, then I don't have to die, and so I can avoid death. Therefore, I want to support the rapture. Therefore, I got to support Israel and the Holy Land. What do you think about that?
No, I think it ends up being more. I mean, if you look at sort of the supporters of Israel right now, the few remaining ones in the commentariat, or actually just sort of randos on Twitter, I mean, the general sentiment is not so much about Israel. It's about how terrible Hamas is. And then by extension, how terrible Palestinians are, and by extension, how terrible Arabs are, and then Muslims. Like, that's a pretty quick logical chain they draw. Look what Hamas did in Palestine, because Palestinians support them, and Arabs do the same thing, and Islam teaches jihad. And it goes right there. And it's like, okay. I mean, it's racism. I mean, it's not a fully elaborated scientific racism, but I can't explain it any other way. I mean, they think of that whole group of people as a monolithic biological entity whose essence is impossible to negotiate with, impossible to give civil rights to, because they'll vote for terrorists who will kill us all. They are irrational because they behead children allegedly, and they blow up children, and they fly themselves into buildings. It's like, again, how many jihadis, guys, have there been among the 2 billion Muslims on earth, guys? 0.000000001%. I mean, they're really, so from that you conclude that Arabs as a group, fuck them. There's nothing you can do with them. Which is why Sam Harris like starts fantasizing about nuking them preemptively in his books and shit. So,
Okay, I Let's, if you don't mind, switch topics. I want to mention that your 2013 talk at the Libertarian Convention, the one I think in New Hampshire,
Oh yeah, that was fun.
that talk alone really, really changed my life. And I've shared that with
Oh,
a
cool.
handful of people. And one of the main topics that really got me thinking was shame. And you said, and I'm reading this, shame, public shaming is the health of the state,
Yeah.
not just
Yeah.
war. And so I've
Ooh,
really
wow.
been trying to, I guess, live less shamefully in my life. And I think it's influenced me. It's given me like new awareness and direction of what I want to
good.
do with my life. And but it's
Good.
just like it's just so like baked into our subconscious, I think, to be like ashamed. We don't even consider it until you consciously become aware.
So
Yeah.
I need to revise my comments
Okay.
from 2013, 11 years. When I did that, I had almost no experience with libertarians. I didn't really quite understand them, really. I thought I did sort of, but I didn't at the time. And it's a long story. It's not important. I mean, I can tell you if you want to hear about it, but I was
Yeah.
trying to work that out, like the whole state versus community, right? State versus civilization. The state loves shame, for sure. It uses it all the time. Hello, that's kind of how it operates, right? From foreign policy all the way down to every domestic policy, the shame is employed or deployed at some point on every issue. On every issue. Not just sex issues, like every issue, right? Shame is, I mean, look at the foreign policy debate now. It's like all about who's evil, who's not, who's good, who's bad, who kills baby, who's a pedophile, who doesn't, who's not a pedophile. Like, well, the thing is, though, the state is a subset of civilization. It's a form of civilization. You might call it like the apparatus of modern civilization.
The political civilization.
It's the apparatus of a civilization doesn't have to have a state. It almost always has, but it doesn't need one. I mean, civilization, you could say a community with norms and membership, norms of membership. That's a civilization, right? But it's not a state. I mean, like there's a lot of what are called civil society organizations, a lot of churches for sure, have hierarchies and norms of internal citizenship. You have to behave in certain ways. And when you do that, you're allowed all the internal rights of the organization. It's not a state, but it's most certainly a civilization, and it has serious rules in it. And if you violate the rules, you're not put in prison, but you're expelled immediately and permanently, right? So and those organizations, of course, use shame just as much. And the point I'm making here is that civilization, really, generally all civilizations, rely, or at least have relied on shame to control people in the modern era. And that's kind of that's Michel Foucault's one of his great interventions, is that he showed that, or at least he made an argument that like the use of shame by civilizational authorities and state actors begins with the modern era. Before then, they just cut off people's heads or stuck them in a dungeon or threatened them physically with violence, or direct physical coercion was usually what was used, according to Foucault and most historians. I think it's right. But then with the Enlightenment in particular, and then all the revolutions, the so-called democratic revolutions of the 18th and 19th centuries, mass politics, you got to shame these motherfuckers, or else they're going to wild out. You're giving political power to the masses, and you think that's going to go well without telling them how to behave? Don't you think we should tell them how to behave? Of course, this is not what was said, but this is what was done. Beginning in this country, and then right after that in France, with the Revolution in France, the Jacobins and the French revolutionaries, and the founding fathers all like just laid on the moralistic shaming of the people and talked about how they needed to reform themselves because they're a bunch of drunks and whores, which they largely were, and not hardworking, peasant types who had never done wage labor, so they were never forced to work hard. Basically slaves of some sort or another, right? And, whores operated on the streets of every European and American city freely usually without fear of being locked up in that period. And alcohol was like through the roof in this country. I have a whole section in my book, Renegade History, about that. How much, I think was it a quart a day or something for the average American adult at the time of the American Revolution. I'm talking about of whiskey or the equivalent. People were drunk as fuck and they were like having fucking everywhere on the streets. And, it was just complete chaos in many ways. And this is in Europe as well. And so this whole wave of shame began really in earnest in the 19th century, like with the early American Republic, right after the American Revolution, and then across Europe. Napoleon was a part of this. But you have through the 19th century, and this is where Foucault really shines, he really shows this, you have the emergence of what? The psychiatric profession. There was no psychiatric profession. There was no psychological profession. It was just priests before that. But all of a sudden, there's a whole occupation and a profession with its own norms and rules and guidelines and systems of thought and ideology, and books and pamphlets and lectures were written for this new field. And then all of a sudden there's these people called psychiatrists and psychologists. And what were they saying through the 19th century? Look at what these people are doing with their bodies. A lot of stuff about sex. They sort of invented or created or discovered homosexuality in 1868. This is who I'm talking about. Psychologists in Germany did this. A lot about drinking. Benjamin Rush, the first basically psychiatrist in American history, one of the founding fathers, wrote an entire book about alcoholism. He invented the concept of alcoholism. And he says the only cure for it is lifelong abstinence. He just made that up, by the way. He might have been right, but he just made it up. But all this, and then they started locking up prostitutes across the 19th century in the West and especially in the United States. They started enforcing for the first time prostitution laws and locked up generations of prostitutes, put them in reformatories where they were forcibly made into mothers and wives. They locked up all the orphans and all the bastard children who were mostly on the streets before then and put them in orphanages and reformatories and tried to make them into good citizens. Then you have mass conscription at the same time. 19th century is when you first see like real mass industrial scale conscription into huge industrialized armies, like in the Civil War here. Good example, right? Where you're not just killing tens of thousands anymore. It's now hundreds of thousands and maybe tens of thousands in a single week or even in a day. And
Gettysburg.
So
that's where
there's a mass everywhere. Yeah. So there's a mass disciplinary attempt, or an attempt to discipline the masses in the West during this period with the rise and because of the rise of democracy. And that's my book. I mean, that's the first chapter in particular in the book about the founding fathers. This is what they themselves said. We're giving these people the vote. We're giving the people political power, but they're a bunch of losers and louts and degenerates, and they've got to be disciplined. And we can only do that through shame. We can only, if we convince them that they are bad, they will change themselves. This is a mass shaming effort.
So my research, this is my PhD thesis. It's the economics of suicide. And part of it, I read a good book by Thomas Hippler on like citizens, soldiers, and armies of like the revolutionary period. And he talks about, I guess, a little bit of like social engineering. And this would be kind of like, shame would be like a function of social engineering, right? Would you agree?
Would I agree?
Yeah.
It's like a category question. Again, it's shame is a form of social engineering.
Uh-huh.
Social engineering is the broader category, I think, in this case. So
yeah.
shame would be a form of it.
Right. Yeah. That's what I mean.
So they go to get now. Wait a second, though.
Yeah.
And interesting. When I think social engineering, and everyone should think this way, you should think progressives, because they invented that term. They invented it. The original progressives, the turn of the 20th century progressives. They used that term and they were very proud of it. Loved talking about social engineering and engineering society. And those guys, I mean, they had their moments of shame. They led the social purity movement, for one thing, which locked up a lot of the prostitutes. Although the real true social engineering types were professors. A lot of them at Columbia and Harvard, Wisconsin, later on Berkeley and Stanford. That's where eugenics comes from. And Occidental College. You know about the eugenics history at Oxy? We had a nice little eugenics. Oh, yeah. The #1 eugenics lab was in Pasadena.
Really?
You didn't know that?
No.
Yeah. And there were 2 or 3 Oxy professors who were like their main scientists.
Really?
Yeah. Look, Paul Popenoe was the head of that lab. And he had a connection to Oxy, and then, I know he recruited Oxy professors who they were professional eugenicists.
Wow.
Like in the 1920s, 30s, I think. So 20s. So forget where we were. What was this broader stuff? Oh, social engineering. So those guys and eugenicists are like to me, they're the progressives par excellence. And every major progressive was a eugenicist, by the way. I don't know of one who opposed it. They all embraced it. And every eugenicist was a progressive too. That's for sure. Those guys were less about shaming, and more about engineering, more about doing science, right? And doing rationality and discovering the cold biological truth about a thing. And then you will know how to manage it and regulate it and control it. They did some public shaming stuff, but by and large, those progressives who were like the engineers, you know what they ended up doing mostly? They ended up being city managers in liberal cities. So if you look at Madison, Wisconsin, Berkeley, California, a lot of college towns, a lot of cities and towns across the country that were taken over by progressives in the 1900s and 1910s and 20s, they introduced this model called the city manager model, which is that the mayor is elected, city council is elected, but they don't run anything. The person who runs things actually manages the city is called the city manager, or sometimes city engineer is actually called sometimes. And they were usually trained in engineering, but they made all the decisions about what happened in the city. I mean, they were the effective mayor.
Like planning, okay.
All of it.
But culturally,
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Whether there's an opera, whether the city has an opera or invites the opera, or whether it has a jazz band, was up to the city manager.
Whoa.
They always chose the opera, by the way. There's a whole history about this. I mean, there's a great book about progressives in Chicago, turn of the 20th century, and the settlement houses where they reformed the immigrants. Every immigrant went through a settlement house run by a progressive. Jane Addams was the most famous one of these, Hull House. And they would do big, events, cultural events with music, right? Mm-hmm. And they were absolutely, totally against jazz or any music that wasn't European classical music. And dancing, the only dancing that was allowed was the waltz, because you are very stiff and you move in a square shape. So very, very assimilationist and rigorous in that way. City managers. So the engineering piece of progressivism actually has less shame in it.
Huh. I want to ask you this.
But it's scarier. That's why it's scarier. Because you don't see it coming. Because they're not yelling at you in public about how evil you are. You're just running your city that you live in.
Right.
They're just running the city you live in, and wherever you're sitting right now, they're making a decision about whether that exists, that street where you are, whether as,
Yeah.
you're not sitting right there, Matt, unless these guys make a particular decision to have a street right where you are, and then to zone it in a particular way so that there's housing there, and then whether there's lighting on it. The police were controlled by them too, so of course, and they knew it was right, and they weren't elected.
It kind of does disturb me where, like, right now I'm in Arizona, driving down streets in Arizona that look so similar to parts of like California and Orange County. And I'm like, I wish I could see something different, but it's like the gridding, the streets, the street lights, like there's, do you know what I mean?
America, yes. So American cities, I'd say it's a little bit better now than when I was like in the 70s and 80s, but man, it's hard to tell a city apart from another one.
Yeah. Yeah.
Europeans say this when they come here and visit. I mean, other than New York, Boston, like San Francisco, maybe LA, but even most of LA looks like most of America. Apart from, and maybe parts of a little bit of Chicago. If I plunked you down in downtown anywhere, you would have a hard time telling where you are.
Yes.
I remember I was in Indianapolis many years ago, and I was right in smack dab downtown Indy. And I remember looking around being like, I have absolutely no idea where. I mean, I would have no idea where I am from this.
Yeah, it's also like hard to walk. Like when I lived in Madrid, I can walk everywhere, take the metro, but like here, most places in America, it's like difficult, I find it, to like get around without a car. And I yearn for Europe. I like walking on the cobblestone knowing there's like hundreds of years of history that's been here.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah.
Let me ask you this, because so my research, the economics of suicide, I remember a good professor, Lucas Dominiak in Poland, mentioned that for what I'm studying, if I don't read and cite Foucault, I will fail. So I want to ask you, what parts of Foucault, or honestly general advice or topics you could like recommend that I look into? I'll just tell you my minute thesis is basically how the existence of the state produces more suicides than what otherwise would occur in a free society through the institutions of money production and the business cycles, how that funds militarism, the public education system, even the healthcare system, and like, yeah.
Go ahead.
Well,
and then you draw a causal line to suicide from that?
More just, yeah, how like, for example, with money production and like the production of recessions, in a way, like a lot of people, finances is their biggest stressor in life. They commit suicide for this. There's many reasons why people commit suicide: love, heartbreak, anger. But then military, 1 in 4 vets commit suicide. In the public school system, this is like, as Michael said, like some of the only places children ever experience violence. Why are we forcing all these kids to be homogenized? Assimilation. And then with the medical thing, I mean, the COVID lockdowns, but what's more alarming is like Yuri Maltsev has talked about how in socialized medicine, the doctors are called veterinarians because the people are cattle. And like, basically, the model is that if you're not an asset, you're a liability. And so socialized medicine is like public slavery, whereas bad as private slavery is, at least you're an asset. But under public slavery, there's no incentive to like maintain you. Right. So they just put people to death after a certain age. And like I feel like Canada is like medically assisted in dying, and dying with dignity is like putting people to death. And then they're saying this is suicide, but I'm saying that's murder labeled suicide.
Yeah. So biopolitics, you know about Foucault's theory of biopolitics?
I'm not too familiar with Foucault, but I would love to ask you.
I mean, I guess that's where this is going, or would go.
I think also like the social, cultural concepts, I guess, that are relevant.
So I'm pretty sure Foucault would disagree with you.
Okay.
Or at least I think he would, I think not he, but his theory of biopolitics, I think troubles your thesis, as we say. I'm not positive about this, and I'd have to read your thing, but based on what you just said, the theory of biopolitics is not so much that there's a specific objective of the state, except to maintain itself, to perpetuate itself, of course, but that's in any institution, any organization, almost any individual, right? That's so. But the use of what he calls biopolitics, which is first the study of populations, kind of the way the way you were talking about populations and the way they're thought of by the health ministries, right, it sounded very Foucauldian, actually. Seeing populations as newly created objects, like, oh, there's no longer individuals, certainly, and not even, families that we're thinking about and building policy around. It's populations where there's a number, and it's usually a really big number, and we have to figure out how to deal with this population. So the object of control, the object of regulation, and therefore the object of policy becomes a mass, and mass is the word, mass of people, undifferentiated mass of human beings. And even that's not his main point. His main point is that we then study the population, and sometimes that'll go down to the individual level, but it's always to better understand the population, and always to better understand how to control or regulate or manage them, right? So it's the study of populations of people to better understand and manage them. And now, again, that sounds sinister and devious, and it sort of is, and it can be, but it's also like that's what any leader of any large organization would do if they're intelligent, which again is Foucault's point. This is a very smart way of managing populations politically. So he says it begins with the advent of the medical profession and the psychiatric profession in the 19th century. States started to employ these people they call doctors to study people and then report to the state in various ways just by publishing, here's what the people are doing, and here's how they think, and here's how they behave, and here's their pathologies. Here's all the bad stuff they do. That's a problem. And now we have to have policy to deal with this. We have homosexuals. We discovered homosexuals in 1868. And then by 1910, there's a whole movement about how to deal with the homosexuals. What laws do we pass to deal with homosexuals? So vagrancy laws, loitering laws were enacted at that time. And then venereal disease abatement laws during the war, World War I. And what happens during World War I? About 30, 40 years after they discovered homosexuals, they start locking up homosexuals. So it was but they discovered homosexuals by looking at their bodies, literally. And they said, oh, the homosexual has this kind of a body type, yada, yada, yada. They started to attribute all these characteristics to the homosexual. So that's just one example. That's sort of the most classic example. Foucault uses that a lot. It's a great example. But they did it with everybody. They did it with women especially. So women were examined. Freud spent a lot of his career doing this, examining women, describing their particular pathologies and neuroses. But the whole progressive movement within psychology, psychiatry was all about there's women who sell sex on the street. Why do they do that? Let's discover their psychology that explains why they do this bad thing. And then we can have proper legislation to address this problem, right? The question's never like, is it a problem? Why is it bad? Premises are not questioned. The science is deployed to address what is a preconceived problem. So, biopolitics is that. It's about studying in a real way. Like if you were the boss of a company that had 1,000 employees, and I said to you, oh, well, we can have a psychiatrist go examine every one of your employees and give you the results and reports and tell you everything about them. Would you not want that to keep Yes, of course. How about if you were the head of an army? Of course, you want to know, because you've got to control these fucking people in your organization or else you lose power. You want to know everything you can about them to better regulate them and manage them. That's Foucault's argument about biopolitics. So having them kill themselves, or I know it's not deliberate in what you're saying, but to sustain systems like public health care or selective service or whatever, monetary easing, all the things that you're saying lead to, that if they see this, like in Canada, like, okay, we see people are killing themselves in greater numbers, the state is not going to say, cool. The state doesn't want dead citizens. The state needs citizens and their bodies to work, to be productive, to build an economic base from which the state can operate. It also, of course, famously needs bodies for the military to protect the state and the police force to protect the state. It needs bodies that are active and actually efficient and healthy. Social engineers want you to be alive, very much so. So that I think that's what Foucault's theory of biopolitics would say to you.
I mean, I guess, what would you say about like the idea of like identity and how the state wants you to identify with nationalism but like, I don't know, I feel like they kind of break your individuality in that process.
The state doesn't want you to commit suicide. It wants you to commit murder-suicide.
Yeah.
When you're in the military. But even then, they don't want you to kill yourself. I mean, you're a hero, but they don't want that. They want an Israeli Gaza ratio. They want very few of us to die and very many of them to die. So no, the state, it's not ever in the interest of the state. The only time it's in the interest of the state to kill people is when they are incorrigible. And there are people who are just completely uncivilizable, like truly.
Well, what about like democide?
Or feral.
Of like the 20th century. Like, isn't that a clear example of like the state killing its own citizens? And
what do you mean?
Well,
which like, give me an example.
Like in the Soviet Union, like, I mean, that's kind of a genocide on Ukraine, but then you have like, I mean, R.J. Rummel,
good,
the demographer.
Yeah. Or Cambodia.
Yeah.
Great example, right? Pol Pot. Yeah, well, the argument that I would make is that Pol Pot destroyed his state. And look what happened to Pol Pot. Like, wouldn't they have been better off by studying the people of Cambodia than shooting them in the back of the head? And I mean, he would, for his own sake, to maintain his own power and then give them what they want, at least to a certain extent, or whatever, I mean, there's multiple means of control, right, that states have used over the people, and same with Stalin. And well, I mean, Stalin, it's the famines that killed all the people, right, or many of the people who died in the Soviet Union. I mean, that wasn't his objective. The objective wasn't to kill all the peasants. He needed the food production. And what happened to the Soviet economy as a result of those famines? It tanked because you now had no longer peasants making the grain.
I don't know.
To feed.
I've been reading The White Pill by Malice, and he talks about like the ethnic cleansing of the Ukrainians, and
so that book's idiotic, and it's based on virtually no research. And as I said to him when he was on my show, when he asked to be on my show to flog that book, I told him that it's very selective, and one of the main scholars that he uses as a source for that book is Anne Applebaum.
Yeah.
Do you know who Anne Applebaum is? I guess not.
I've heard him talk about it. I have her book Red Famine right here, and he's like, she's a leftist and stuff like that. But
no, she's not a leftist.
Well, he's like, her work on Ukraine.
No, she works. Good. No, she works for the State Department.
Really?
Indirectly, I mean, no. Her husband is the head of the political party in Poland that works directly with the State Department and the CIA. Like, this is known. I mean, it's not even, she is a NATO. She's the leading NATO propagandist. She's not necessarily paid by them, but that's everything she's ever written has been with the intention of slandering everything that's Russian.
Wow.
Now, I'm an anti-communist. I was an anti-Stalinist when I was born. I have never once had anything good to say about the Soviet Union, Stalin, communism at all. Fuck all of that. 100% top to bottom. Not a single thing good about it. But her whole argument is actually not about the Soviet Union ultimately. It's ultimately about Vladimir Putin. Because what they always do Timothy Snyder's the other one. Anne Applebaum and Timothy Snyder are the two leaders in this. Timothy Snyder's a professor of history at Yale. It's just stunning that he's a professor of anything, anywhere, but he is a psychotic propagandist for the U.S. imperial state and NATO. It's just wild what they make up about Putin and the current Russian state, which is not the Soviet Union. It's not communist. And what have they wanted to do since 1991? Trade with us. Trade with us. Trade with us. They have great caviar and vodka. Why are we fucking with these people? That's all they want to do. So no, Anne Applebaum's whole and Timothy Snyder's books, they've written extensive books about World War II, Stalin's atrocities. Most of it's true. I mean, about the Soviets and Stalin, sure, most of it. But you'll see there is in their work an attempt to locate this in the Russian consciousness. These atrocities are the result of a Russian personality, historical consciousness. It's in the Russian character. Putin also did work in the KGB, was a leader of the KGB. As a matter of fact, it's true. But that doesn't mean that he still is a Stalinist in that way. It's not even clear that he was a Stalinist in that way when he was in the KGB. So no, she's not a real scholar. It's a terrible book. So no.
I want to mention, because I know we got to wrap up, but when I was in DC, we went to this man, Paul Horvath's house for breakfast to discuss Ukraine and Russia for 3 hours. His wife's a journalist for like Wall Street Journal. He brought over this guy, Dave Bowker. This guy, Paul, wants to run for like Senate or Congress. And in his living room, he said, this is where the CIA was founded. And he's like really politically connected. But I did I've been listening, like I said, to your Unreported show, and I took my notes and my points, and also from Dave Smith. And I just ideologically battled these guys, and Paul is like, well, like, it looks like Putin has to like restock with troops from the east, and that's gonna take 6 months, and within those 6 months we can go hard, and there's a 50-50 chance he'll use tactical nukes in Ukraine, but like, we can take those odds. And I'm just like astonished. And I don't know, at the end of it, the director Martin was like, you really seem like you did your research, and I'm proud of you. You did a good job. And so so thank you that I was able to do that.
No, thank you. Yeah, that's great. So Alan Dulles, was this like Alan Dulles' apartment or something on Capitol Hill? He's the founder of the CIA.
It was in Georgetown. It was in Georgetown. I mean, I don't know. It might have been his house. He said that every president has been in this room since FDR except Trump. It's a little bit eerie, but also that place was like, when they redid it, there was like 60 bugs, like Russian bugs in it.
Well, I mean, the CIA was every president's private army until Trump, in which point they became a private army against Trump, against the president. And now they're back to being the private army for the president. Pretty amazing.
Well, hopefully next time you're on the show, we can talk more about the CIA and maybe Russia, Ukraine. Hopefully we don't have to, but...
Totally. No, we always have to. We will always have to, because it will be history when it's over. Yeah. So we'll always have to talk about it.
Thank you so much. I really
Hey, dude, thank you, man. And keep on doing your thing. This is great.
You've definitely given me a lot of like encouragement, and I will keep this podcast going.
Just work on your hardware.
I will.
That's all. But it cleaned up. The last hour have been good.
Yeah. No, I mean, I unplugged my camera, so.
Oh, why did you? Okay.
Because
it's great now.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you, Matt. This is great, man.